Welcome back to Trade Links, brought to you by NatWest. My name's Tim Phillips. And welcome back to our regular panel, and that means Aastha Gupta, European economist, economics and market strategy for NatWest Markets. Hello, Aastha.
Hi, Tim.
Also, Scott Livingstone, international advisor, NatWest Group, our geopolitics expert. Scott, are we allowed to reveal where you are?
Hello, Tim. And yes, I'm in Glasgow at the moment, the hub of geopolitics in this country, I would argue.
That's not very secret, is it? I think we can say that. If you are all getting whiplash from trying to follow who said what about where, then we're here to help you make sense of what's going on in trade at the moment. And in this new world order we find ourselves in, trade deals, well, they're not always about trade, and they're certainly not always exclusively about trade. So today we're going to be talking about two aspects of that. India's deal blitz, what's real and what's politics, and as the World Trade Organization, remember them, debates the way forward, we're asking whether the WTO still matters. So, in other words, what's in a deal?
A moment, years in the making. The Prime Minister and his Indian counterpart today signed the long-awaited trade deal between the two countries.
The mother of all deals, the leaders of India and the European Union signing in the last hour or so a huge trade pact reached after 2 decades of negotiations.
Aastha, first of all, let's talk about India. Now, India has announced trade agreements with the EU, the US, and the UK. Are these all the same type of deal? And if they're not, what are the differences?
Not at all, Tim. I wouldn't really put them in the same category. Yes, they are all labeled as trade deals, but economically and politically, these agreements sit on very different parts of the trade policy spectrum. With the EU and the UK, we're talking about traditional comprehensive free trade agreements, which involve commitments around tariffs, services access, digital trade, mobility, and regulatory cooperation. So basically the full architecture. And these are big, comprehensive deals, and they cut across broad-based sectors, which also means that the negotiations are a lot more slower, but are politically sensitive. If you look at EU's deal, it's particularly more about regulatory compatibility. It's about whether India and Europe can align on things like carbon policies, digital governance, environmental standards. So it's not just about trade flows, it's about the rules and the values that are embedded in the agreement. If you look at India-UK agreement, I think it's slightly different because it's post-Brexit. I think the reflection is more about the agility. The arrangement with the US is completely different because it's a lot more strategic and contractual. In the recent years, we've seen that US hasn't had much appetite for broad FTAs. So instead of a single sweeping agreement, the deal with the US is more of targeted economic partnership, which is focusing on specific irritants. Things like market access for certain goods, dispute settlement on tariffs, energy and supply chains. So the deal is narrower economically, but heavier geopolitically. So overall, India is pursuing one template. It's tailoring its approach depending on the partner, where we're seeing regulatory integration with Europe, speed with the UK, and strategic alignment with the US. It's trying to strengthen its trade relationships, but with very different scale, ambition, and political economy behind each one.
Scott, Aastha's talking about things like political economy and strategic alignment. And I note that what really grabbed the headlines about this India deal was the US trying to get an agreement for India not to use Russian oil. Can we conclude from all of this that these deals are really driven by politics rather than trade these days?
Of course, they're driven by politics. I think they always were, although I think the danger is that we take out a political dimension and we elevate that to be the driving force. I think fundamentally the driving force is the rather, dare I say as a geopolitist, a rather boring, broad set of economic gains and benefits and agreements. But for sure, it's entangled in geopolitics. And the India-Russia oil trade was tacked on to the 25% tariffs that the Americans imposed on India, and then was subsequently lifted when the trade deal was signed. And we saw a fall in Indian imports of Russian oil, something like 20%. It's down from over 40% down to something like 23% at the moment, and it may well drop further. So yes, the answer is yes. This is about politics. It always has been. It's a complicated set of relationships. And partly that's why some of these deals, like the EU and India deal, took 20 years in the making. And partly because of the trade aspects, partly because the politics were turbulent at different phases. I think it's becoming more so, Tim, in recent history as we see the increased weaponization of trade with the arrival of the Trump administration and his approach to tariffs, for example, and a sense of fragmentation across the globe and trade becoming much more weaponized in states' assessment of their national security interests. I've got my personal view on the Russian oil. I'm rather inclined to believe the idea that imposition of 25% tariffs in the first place was also related to Modi not supporting Donald Trump's claim to have solved the war with Pakistan. And I couldn't help but note that the US-India deal was signed, I think, 5 or 6 days after the deadline for the nominations for this year's Nobel Peace Prize, which, of course, no one knows who is on that list.
Aastha, as Scott points out, EU deal's been a couple of decades in the making now. People like me assume that as soon as anything's announced, well, that's it, it's all done and dusted. It all kicks in next week. We don't yet know about the exact substance of this, do we? What is the path to ratification and what can happen along that path?
I think there are two uncertainties. One is about the depth of these trade deals, and the second, as you mentioned, is about the ratification. When it comes to the depth of the trade deals, what we really don't know yet is how deep the liberalization really goes and where does it actually bite. So take India-EU's example, and within that, take autos as an example, which grabbed the headlines. So yes, a tariff cut from about 110% to something closer to 40% does sound dramatic. But the question that we really need to ask is, on what cars? Are we talking about fully built up imports, like which are the completely built up CBUs? Or are we talking about vehicles that are already locally assembled? Because most high volume European models sold in India are already assembled locally under a completely knocked down version structures that are happening. And they face significantly lower duties of around 15%. And I think the real question here isn't really about whether the tariffs fall from 110 to 40%. It's really about whether these deals changes localization incentives, supply chains, and investment decisions. And then second, of course, is the ratification aspect, because the negotiations have agreed on headline tariff schedules, but the legal text really takes time. And of course, there is this angle of political approval, especially on sensitive sectors like agriculture and autos, that can stretch the timeline for years. And that means the substance can shift right until the end. So even once we see a deal announcement, it may take months or even years before companies actually feel the benefits. And it's a process with lots of moving parts.
In the short term, though, Aastha, this incentive for India to change its behavior and that mutual incentive for both sides to change their behavior immediately, is that already kicking in?
I doubt that it's going to kick in the short term because these sectors have a lot more political leverage. So you don't really see the impact in the short term. All of this happens in the medium term because the details are not really, clearly laid out yet.
Even when it comes to, Scott was saying, that shifting away from Russian oil.
So here, I think the evidence suggests that there has been a lot more pragmatism rather than a pivot, because India has bought discounted Russian crude oil because it made a lot more economic sense. I think India's core priorities have been maintaining energy security and affordability. And what these deals may do over a time is to broaden India's options. One could be more LNG from the US, possibly greater cooperation on renewables with Europe, and diversification of suppliers. But that would take some time. But trade agreements don't instantly redirect flows. All they do is change incentives, as you said, that too gradually. And yes, if geopolitical pressure does intensify, or if price differentials narrow, we could see more diversification. But at this stage, India's energy policy looks more guided by pure economics rather than external leverage.
I want to ask both of you what's going to change for India and for the EU and for the US and the UK if these deals manage to achieve their objectives. Aastha, let's go to you first and then Scott, finish off.
So if these deals do land well, I think the big change for India would be integration, being more deeply plugged into global supply chains, especially in manufacturing, services, and green technologies, and which would support its ambition to become a major manufacturing and services hub in a China +1 sort of a world. For the EU, US, and UK, I think the upside is access to a high and fast-growing market, plus supply chain diversification into an economy that's relatively large, stable, and geopolitically important. It means somewhat reduced dependency on China for certain goods and more resilience in critical sectors, and even better access to Indian services and talent. And interestingly, the macro impact may depend less on tariff cuts and more on credibility, as investments tend to respond better to predictability.
Scott, do you agree?
I do, yeah. I think geopolitically, the upside, particularly for India, the EU and the UK, is all around diversification and resilience in this fragmenting, turbulent geopolitical environment. I think that's what they get. And potentially it's massive. I mean, the EU-India deal, two things. The scale of it is something we need to keep an eye on. A quarter of the world's population, a quarter of the world's GDP is involved in this. So I think there are potentially enormous geopolitical positives there for both, actually. And also another point, Tim, not to forget about the India-EU deal, was it came with a side deal, a defense engagement, which if that lands, then I think that could really change the projection of hard power in South Asia. Keep an eye particularly on the French engaging very hard on a sale, another incredibly large deal for jet fighters into India with a joint venture with local manufacturing. So it is pivoting the relationship significantly. So I would say for those countries, the upside is around diversification, resilience, and a real shift in defense relationships, I would suggest. For the States, I think President Trump will wish to demonstrate global dominance in relationships, the effectiveness of his negotiating style. My personal view is I think there could be a coda to this deal, which is to do with the loss of trust, perhaps, and how this deal and how the tariffs were applied and then reversed. So I think, yes, there will be an upside for the US, and the US is continuing to sell weapons and equipment into India. But nonetheless, I suspect the impact on the style of negotiations has been considerable this year.
There's a lot more to all of these stories. And I note also, Scott, this side deal in defense as well, which is something that we will be returning to later in this series. We also need to talk about the World Trade Organization. Aastha, it is the 14th WTO Ministerial Conference, as these things are called, MC14. It's happening at Yaoundé, Cameroon. In the old world, then the WTO was synonymous with global trade. It was made easier. It was arbitrated by the WTO. What is it that the WTO uniquely added to make this era of global trade possible? How do we measure its economic effect, Aastha?
I think the WTO's unique contribution was certainty. Before the WTO, trade rules basically were a bit like optional homework. Everyone agreed they were good in theory, but you didn't always know who was actually following them. So the WTO turned global trade into a rules-based system with binding commitments, transparent tariff schedules, and a dispute settlement body that in its heyday really did enforce those rules. So WTO turned global trade into something with a lot more certainty. Economically, the impact was huge because we saw lower tariffs, smoother supply chains, and a massive expansion in cross-border trade. You can literally see the WTO's effect in the data, where we saw the global trade volumes jumped after its creation, especially in early 2000s, when there was hyper-globalization and where global value chains were exploding. So its value wasn't just reducing tariffs. it was really in reducing uncertainty, which fueled investment and efficiency. And firms invested across borders because they believed in market access wouldn't suddenly be withdrawn, which is not the case now. So it's difficult to quantify this credibility angle, but it had its own economic benefits.
Looking back, that era has gone now. The WTO is still there, but its power is very much diminished. With hindsight, Scott, what was the beginning of the end for the WTO? We're assuming an end. What diminished its power?
Well, I am assuming an end. You've heard me speak before about the shift of power from west to east and the erosion of the institutions and structures for global governance that was set up after the Second World War. And I think the WTO falls into that second category. So I think the writing is on the wall. When did the writing start to go on the wall? I think the first key geopolitical event was China's accession in 2001. Huge hopes about what this would mean. And I think now there is some revision going on to the assumptions that joining the WTO would lead to a shift in Chinese domestic politics and how power was structured in China. But for the WTO point of view, I think China's arrival was the first key moment, because the WTO very quickly appeared to be impotent when faced with complaints about state subsidies to Chinese companies. So I think point one was China arriving in, and frankly, the WTO not being fit for purpose in terms of policing its own rules in that space. The second key point, I would argue, Tim, was the financial crisis. And again, I think from the financial crisis, and also, by the way, from the pandemic, there was a broader loss of trust and a hope around hyperglobalization. And clearly the WTO's role in promoting that was undermined. Thirdly, I would say Trump's first time as president, because then we really saw the position between Washington and the WTO crystallized into a significant complaint about the WTO structured to, as Donald Trump would say, I think he did say, to rip off America, and also complaints about the inadequacy of policing China's contribution in world trade. And then finally, I think the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and that subsequently followed by Donald Trump's second term in office, what we've seen is this weaponization of trade, and increasingly in this space, the WTO being irrelevant in how states use trade to either safeguard their national interest or to present pressure, to coercive leverage in their geopolitical dealings. And really, the WTO isn't at the races when it comes to how states are behaving now.
It's not death by 1,000 cuts, but it's death by at least 4, isn't it? What is already replacing it? Aastha, there are all sorts of trade deals and coalitions and clubs that are coming in place of what used to be those WTO-style agreements. What's taking up the slack?
I think we're seeing a patchwork world emerge. On one side, we have managed trade deals, like the US-Japan semiconductor agreement. Then you also have export control clubs, like the US-EU-Japan coordination on chip manufacturing equipment. We also heard talks of a possible critical minerals trade club a couple of weeks back. And we've got sanction coalitions, especially around Russia and Iran, which are essentially parallel systems for controlling trade flows. So instead of one global referee, we have now lots of small clubs in this growingly fragmented world.
It will be a challenge for us all to keep abreast of, really, because these mini-lateral agreements or clubs, I quite like that, I think they are going to proliferate. And occasionally they will be difficult to see the boundaries of them and to check the agreements and the progress and really just how solid they are in a meaningful way. But there will be many of them, and some of them will be quite narrow in terms of the issues, whether it be the supply chains of rare earth or critical minerals, and others will be much, much broader. And so we are facing a much more complicated world and again, I like Aastha's phrase, this patchwork of these smaller agreements and arrangements, and there will be tensions between them. So I think it does present a challenge in understanding the landscape.
Aastha, one of the major goals, perhaps the major goal of MC14, is to work out what the WTO does in future and what it's for. What's your opinion on this? What's the minimum viable WTO going forward?
That's a very tricky question, Tim.
Mm-hmm.
The minimum viable WTO, I think, is a system that still provides transparency, basic trade rules, and some pathway even if it's a slow one, to solve or resolve disputes. And at the very minimum, I would say it is to restore some form of dispute settlements, because without enforcement, it loses its anchor goal. And secondly, given that it's a plurilateral framework, so we should be able to have plurilateral agreements within the WTO framework where willing members can move forward on issues which are a lot more pertinent today, like digital trade or environmental goods, without requiring full consensus, because that is where countries can stall progress. So in essence, the WTO may no longer define the golden age of globalization that we saw in early 2000s, but even in a fragmented world, it can still serve as a stabilizing foundation beneath a complex trade architecture.
So in our final section, you know what's coming now, I'm going to ask both of you to tell me something that's on your agenda that the rest of us might have missed.
Tim, I fear that I'm coming back to something I might have mentioned before, but I'm raising it because I think it is really important, particularly at this time, and that's the rift in relations between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates.
Yes.
Most visible in their regard to regional policy, particularly in Yemen. And I'm drawing this out for two reasons. First of all, I think it doesn't seem to be healing itself in the near term, nor does it seem to be healing as a result of pressure from the US, and of which there is pressure from the US for this to become much more aligned. So we appear to be in a longer term, more significant state of affairs between those two countries. And it really matters for the idea of the GCC as a geopolitical entity. So first reason, it really matters because of that regional power that has such potential for the future. And secondly, it's coming at a time of imminent crisis regarding Iran. And one of the issues regarding the upcoming crisis with Iran is the degree to which it overspills into the Gulf and into the GCC area. So I think this is a very significant development that we should monitor, and it's coming at a very inappropriate time, I would suggest, with the tension with Tehran.
One thing I'm following a lot more closely is the classification and measurement of AI in trade data. Because WTO has made some headway, but AI rarely crosses borders in visible goods because it's embedded in chips, cloud services, data flows. And the current trade statistics weren't really designed for these nuances, which means that AI-related trade that has been reported so far is often undercounted or misclassified. So this is what I'm going to track for the next couple of months.
Thank you very much, both of you. Always fascinating. I always learn a lot. In the future, people in our audience will be saying, what was the first time that you heard about that? And it was probably about now. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow us, leave us a review, especially a good one. We'll be back soon.